We sped northbound on Route 6, coming up to Ash Springs, with the glittering open sewer called Vegas well behind us. The mountains lining the horizon brought dragon teeth to mind, as if the Mojave itself were sitting upon an immense dragon's tongue. Goldie was laying across the back seat, staring dispassionately at the wingless fly that pranced around her forefinger. She'd been toying with the bug since she'd caught it at the last truck stop. She'd pulled off the critter's wings while I was in the restroom, busy packing my left nostril with crank. The crank helped keep my dread and terror in check, at least somewhat. I dreaded and feared what she might one day do to me. I dreaded and feared witnessing her next feast. But most of all, I dreaded and feared that the day was coming when she would seek the affections of another. She barely looked a day past 18, though I knew she was much, much older. Her hair was a deep shade of gold, like sunlight filtered through honey. Her shirt rode up her belly and revealed the ruby-red tattoo above her navel, 2 trillion diamonds coming together for a kiss. "Eyes on the road," Goldie said, without looking up from the insect dancing around her knuckles. I focused on the blacktop stretching out before me, shimmering with heat under the sun's unyielding gaze. Goldie hardly ever spoke, except when necessary. I'd been with her for years now, and we'd never had anything approximating a proper conversation. Suddenly, she sat upright in her seat. "Get ready to pull over," she said, then absent-mindedly popped the fly into her mouth and swallowed it. Up on the shoulder of the road, there was a large sign advertising a truck stop diner out on Route 318. "There," she said, and I rolled the car towards the shoulder. Just behind the sand-scorched diner sign, I heard the distinct sound of a police radio squawking. A speed trap, no doubt. "Stay here," she said, and hopped out. Her miniskirt danced in the wind as she bopped along the road, barefoot, heedless of the sizzling blacktop under her feet. She disappeared behind the sign. I could imagine the cop's "aw shucks, ain't this my lucky day" grin as I heard him say, "Well, hey there, little lady." I lit a Marlboro Red and crushed another line of crank on the dashboard. It wasn't long before I heard the cop shrieking and the useless pop, pop, pop of his service weapon going off. I looked up over the dash as I finished cutting the line just in time to see the unlucky officer as he ran off, blood gushing from the ragged stump that had been his member. We locked eyes for just a moment, and I saw the disbelief and terror etched across the tattered remnants of his face. He made it about 6 feet towards the road when she pierced his chest and lifted him off the ground. He grabbed at the sharp tip of the black chitinous spear that punched through his sternum right before she pulled him towards her hungry maw. I met Goldie almost 10 years ago on a North Vegas sidewalk, shortly after I snuck off a mark I met at the poker tables. I'd been desperate and dope-sick, and he promised to supply me with a gram of black tar in exchange for my services. When I finished and demanded the payment, I got a left hook to the side of my head instead. He dumped me onto the street, then took off. I was on my hands and knees, spitting up mucus and blood and 4 of my back teeth, when I saw her, sitting on the curb, with her porcelain thighs curled up to her chest. She smiled. "I've been waiting for you," she said. Her pale blue eyes flashed silver, and the next thing I knew, we were in the back seat of a stolen sedan. She looked detached as she slid her fingers inside the slick gash between my legs, regarding me the way she did as she toyed with that fly on her finger. My withdrawal symptoms vanished faster than they would have with a methadone hit or even a shot of boiling tar into my veins. I loved her from the start. How could I not? Even when she first revealed herself to me and fed upon a hapless trucker just outside of Bunkerville, I loved her. Whether or not Goldie felt the same way about me, I simply didn't know. Her touch was gentle and her kiss was soft, but her eyes lacked any semblance of warmth. The emotions that she did show rang hollow, as if they were practiced. From then on, I drove, and she'd recline in the back seat, only deciding to speak when she'd tell me when to make a turn or cut off the highway and drive straight into the desert. I never asked any questions as we drove into collapsing concentric circles around the Mojave like water swirling into a drain. Though our routine varied, we always ended up at the same patch of sand at the foot of Spirit Mountain. There was a black cave mountain in the southern mountainside, like a dark eye staring out at the desert. Goldie would leave me then, disappearing into the cave for days at a time. I couldn't bring myself to stare into that black eye for more than a second without turning away, shivering despite the heat. Goldie never said what was inside that cave, and I didn't ask. When she'd re-emerge, we'd drive again, prowling the Mojave in search of sustenance. The days bled together, then the months. Goldie paid for gas, and when she felt like it, food for me. She never ran short on money. When she decided that she wanted to drive for days on end without stopping, she provided the crank to keep me awake, though I'd never seen her actually purchase the stuff. It was all one big cycle, just like our rotating patterns around that hole at the foot of Spirit Mountain. Yet, as those long years stretched onward, I began to suspect that our time together would soon end. I'd started noticing a suitable shift in the way Goldie regarded me. Her gaze, which had been growing silver more often, tended to linger a little longer than before, almost the way she did when she was spying her prey. However, my growing concerns did nothing to diminish my love for her. In fact, one could say those concerns only bolstered my devotion. Even if she was indeed incapable of true emotion, her touch was all the love I needed. She'd cured my addiction and shielded me in this wretched world. She was my queen, and I was happy to remain her loyal cupbearer, come what may. Her name wasn't really Goldie. That was just what I called her, though never out loud. I didn't think she had a name, save for the private ones my predecessors whispered to themselves. There was no mention of her in any native legends or early American ghost stories either. I suspected anyone who ever looked upon her bare form had either loved her or became her meal. She emerged from behind the diner sign. Her mouth was smeared red. She curled her forefinger, beckoning to me, and I went to her. Goldie stripped me naked, then lay me down in the red slick of gravel beside the idling squad car, and had her way with me. I stared down at her blood-smeared lips as she kissed me between my thighs, and it looked as though she was eating me alive. Every time she touched me, she felt more and more ancient, as if to touch her skin was to touch the fabric of time itself. I pictured her nesting under the mountain where it was buried under sheets of ice, under oceans, within the burning, molten landscape at the dawn of time. I imagined the first time she ever emerged from that cave to snatch the unfortunate Navajo scout who made the mistake of waking the Queen of Spiders. When she finished with me, as I lay quivering at her feet, her dispassionate eyes suddenly flashed silver. She gave me that strange look again, and for the briefest moment, I was certain that she was going to devour me. I didn't fear that possibility as much as I should have. Having her fangs sink into my mortal flesh was certainly preferable to her simply casting me aside to suffer this world without her. But she didn't bare her fangs. She only kissed me on the cheek as her eyes faded from silver back to pale blue. She licked her lips clean, then went back to the car, and I scampered after her, naked, clutching my discarded clothes to my chest. She told me to drive northbound. I pulled back onto the road and continued our journey. For the next 2 days, we drove non-stop. The meth became a layer of shattered glass, masking my exhaustion, but even in that fog, I noticed something different about Goldie. She was in the back seat, as usual, but I felt her eyes locked on me as we made our rounds, circling the dragon's tongue. I kept waiting for her to instruct me to cut into the desert, to begin our way back to the cave at Spirit Mountain, but she asked me a question instead. "What do you want to do after I'm finished with you?" Goldie asked. It wasn't the question itself that shocked me, but that she asked at all. Unless I'd forgotten, this must have been the first time she'd asked me a question since the night we met. My crank-addled brain struggled for an answer. "Well, I don't ever want you to finish with me," I said. Her sad smile took me aback, as it was easily the most genuine emotion I'd ever seen her display. "You were my favorite," she said. Then she lay back down on the seat, smiling to herself, and with my heart filled with dread, because were indicated the past tense. The steering wheel became a slick mess from my clammy palms as I considered the implications of Goldie's words. I pictured her with another woman, and the jealousy drove me mad. Yet, I hated myself for harboring this envy, for being so petulant by comparing my mortal concerns to the desires of the Spider Queen, the eternal dread shadow of the Mojave. "When you do finish with me," I said, without taking my eyes off the road, "I hope you'll bless me by filling my belly with your babies. I'd trade my soul for you to lay your silken sacks in the hollowed-out caverns of my body, my beloved queen, so that I can serve you one last time before my dying breath." I glimpsed the rearview mirror. The setting sun was low and shadows danced over us, and I could just barely make out the gentle curvature of Goldie's pretty pink lips. I'd driven her down this road 100 times during our countless roundabout trips. Less than a mile ahead, the lurid establishment burned a garish shade of neon pink that sizzled in the desert night. The closer we got, the more that toxic, cold cathode gas discharge seemed to taunt me. "Stop up here," Goldie said, which didn't surprise me in the slightest. Minutes later, we sat in the brothel's main parlor. I was smoking a cigarette and sinking into the plush velvet sofa with Goldie beside me as the girls filed in. Goldie studied the woman with her slate-colored eyes. Not one of them was a day over 25, each one clad in sinful leather and lace. One young woman in particular stood out. Her scant red lace attire contrasted with her cherubic face and the innocent brown eyes. She was quite beautiful, I'll admit, and Goldie seemed to think so too. My Spider Queen drank in the young woman's slender mocha frame before she turns to me and smiled. "What do you think of that one?" she whispered. I shrugged. Cigarette smoke trailed from my nostrils, and once more I pictured this hard country, brothel and all, sitting upon that dragon's tongue, and how I wouldn't be the least bit saddened if the beast suddenly snapped its jaws shut. "She's pretty," I finally said. "Look closer," Goldie responded. Despite my growing anger and jealousy, I turned a begrudging eye toward the mocha woman. Somehow, now I saw it. Beneath her well-practiced concubine's smirk, I got the unmistakable sense that something within this young woman was broken, just like I'd been when Goldie first found me. Though she lacked the track marks that had pockmarked my veins, it was nevertheless evidence that her seductive smile was no more than a thin mask concealing some shattered innocence within. I wonder what brought the mocha woman here, to this life. She was running from something, just like I'd been. Perhaps, in this world, some women were simply destined to trade flesh for dope or money, and the reasons didn't ever really matter. Goldie hadn't uttered a single word, yet the mocha woman approached us. Her practiced smirk had faded. Her wide brown eyes were brimming with innocence and helplessness and love, like mine had been when Goldie found me, desperate and spilling blood onto the sidewalk. Goldie completed the transaction, and we followed the mocha woman down a dark hallway. Goldie's eyes were glued to the woman's gently swaying hips, those red lace stockings that came halfway up the young woman's caramel thighs. The room was dimly lit, and there was a heart-shaped bed, so red it looked like it had just been cut out of someone's chest. The mocha woman curled up on the bed and waited for us with her chin tucked into her ample chest. A nubile maid so beautiful that it stung to look upon her. Still, as Goldie stalked around the bed, ogling the mocha woman, my jealousy smoldered and burned and threatened to turn to hellfire. My successor may very well have been no more than just another broken young woman forced to trade her flesh for her livelihood. I no longer suffered the guilt I felt when I previously harbored such jealousy. It had been different then, when my replacement was simply hypothetical. But here, up close, the only thing that kept me from slashing her throat was the mere fact that I lacked a piece of shattered glass. But then, Goldie returns to my side. She lifted her right hand, and her two upraised fingers fused and blackened and curved. The dim lamplight danced across the black exoskeletal dagger as she snapped it off her hand and offered it to me. "Do what you think is best," she said to me. She kissed my cheek. "It's up to you." Then she drifted into the dark corner of the room, and her arachnid shadow fell across the heart-shaped bed. The mocha woman simply lay there, her abiding devotion to our queen already so complete that she didn't even flinch when I pressed that chitinous dagger against her neck. Yet, before I could open her throat, I realized those smoldering embers of jealousy had flickered out, now no more than harmless wisps of smoke. I looked down at the mocha woman and recognized what I saw in those submissive brown eyes. She loved me, just as she loved our queen. As I held the dagger against her carotid artery, I felt her meager, mortal pulse reverberate through the blade, and realized what Goldie had done. I placed the dagger on the side table and climbed atop the mocha woman. I toyed with her, as Goldie had toyed with me. I made her scream as Goldie had made me scream. And, at the precise moments I brought her to climax, I caught my reflection in a mirror on the wall, and spotted my eyes flashing silver. The tires kicked up plumes of dust in our wake as the mocha woman navigated the sedan towards the black eye in the mountain. Goldie lay on the back seat with me on top of her, resting my face upon the twin ruby diamonds above her navel, while she ran her fingers through my hair. Dawn broke, and the sun was a fireball rising up from the dragon's throat as the mocha woman pulled up to the cave mouth. She cut the engine, and the cooling mechanism ticked like a hand on a clock. "It's time," Goldie said. We left the mocha girl in the car, and I followed my queen into the mountain's depths. The dark confines were claustrophobic as we transversed the twisting, honeycombed tunnels. If not for Goldie's hand squeezing around my fingers, I'd doubtlessly wander these halls forever, lost and blind. We passed through one final ante-chamber before stepping inside a massive, hollowed-out dome. Above us, bioluminescent creatures shriveled and shrieked at our approach, their tiny, writhing forms giving the impression of starshine. I closed my eyes and inhaled the smell of clay and soil and rock, and tasted echoes of primordial soup on my tongue. Beside me, Goldie shared her mortal artifice to bear herself to me. She loomed high over me, supported on her long, spindly legs. Her eyes dazzled as she clicked her fangs, and I ran my fingers down her smooth pedipalps. I dropped to my knees in both worship and love, and crawled beside her rounded abdomen to kiss those ruby diamonds one last time. "I love you," I told her. I remained on my knees as she rapidly worked her rear legs in unison with her spinnerets, weaving layer upon layer of spider-spun silk around me. Before long, she'd finished layering my chrysalis, and she left me to my rebirth, snug in my cocoon, and already I could feel the change, my skin hardening with protein and chitin, and the hunger slowly growing, a gnawing urge to satiate. It was weeks before I was reborn. I'm something else now, not quite spinning the infinite web like Goldie had done, but something else. Now, I'm a spider with human skin. I go about my day among the flies, catching them in my web periodically, and I'm sitting here, typing this now, after a particularly delicious meal. However, I'm alone, very alone, and each night I pray that I'll see my spider queen again, if only to thank her for this gift.